for tonight, Xerces has been generous enough to offer us Kaitlin and Emily to talk to you about pollinators and pesticides. And I want to put a plug in for Xerces because they're a completely donation and membership-based organization. So please check them out and consider supporting them. Kaitlin, when you go to the next slide.
Yep.
Thank you. So tonight we're going to take turns on this. Kaitlin is our Southwest specialist for pollinators. So she's going to talk to you about what pollinators are and why we should care, some of our native pollinators and how they're different from honeybees. We're going to go over pollinator life cycles, which are important when you start looking at maintenance and planting your garden, and how chemicals impact pollinators. And then I am going to race us through kind of a gardening 101, how to plant, get your garden ready, how to think about what you want to put in, why we have to water, and the most efficient ways to do that here in the desert. And we'll look at 20 pollinator plants that will work just about anywhere. Also, we'll talk a little bit about how to involve kids. And we have an extensive resource list for you at the very end and a QR code that you can scan with your phone that will take you to this PowerPoint, the recording once we get that up, and an expanded resource list. So be ready for that at the end. And then we'll leave time for questions and comments. We're happy to stay late to make sure your questions get answered. And we do ask that you put your questions and comments in the chat because we're going to be moving fast and we'll get to all those questions at the end. And with that, oh, I want to say quickly, there are people here from the East Coast, the West Coast, maybe France. This is geared to New Mexico, particularly northern New Mexico, but the concepts are the same anywhere. And we do have resources for how to find information about your area. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaitlin.
Right. Thanks, Dana. I think we're going to do introductions of ourselves first. But I can go first. Hi, I'm Kaitlin Haase. I am the Southwest Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. I'm based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I've been here a couple of years now working on building pollinator habitat in mostly urban areas in New Mexico. But I've been working on lots of outreach and education, doing lots of speaking events like this one to educate the public about pollinators and their conservation. And yeah, I'm really excited to be talking with you all today. And I'm also available anytime if you want to email me about speaking events or any technical support you might need on creating pollinator habitat. So feel free to reach out to me anytime and look forward to talking to you all. Do you want to go next, Emily Ruth, and then we'll have Dana go next?
Yeah, so hello, everyone. Really good to see you all. My name's Emily Ruth Spindler, and I am the new person at Xerces as the Southwest Pesticide Program Specialist. Super excited to be here. I'm also finishing up some thesis research back in Virginia on toxicity to butterflies, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but yeah, really excited to talk to you all today.
And I'm Dana Ecelberger. I'm a lifelong professional gardener, organic farmer, and landscape designer. And as I did more and more landscapes, I became more and more enamored with all the pollinators that were attracted and started really focusing on native plants wherever I was putting in those gardens. So that's my passion, plants and the pollinators that rely upon them. And all of our contact information will be on the last slide. And we really encourage you to get in touch with us with any questions or comments, or just if you need guidance as you go through this.
Thanks, thanks, Dana. And I'm super excited to be our first speaker. Then we'll move on to Emily Spindler, and then Dana will be talking. So without further ado, I will jump in to my first topic, the importance of pollinators. So there's been a lot of talk about working on protecting pollinators, saving the bees, and why are we so interested in protecting pollinators? Well, pollinators are absolutely essential to the function of our planet. The vast majority of flowering plants require animals to move their pollen and to reproduce. So there are some plants that are dependent on wind pollination. They make very lightweight pollen that blows on the wind. That's what you usually have allergies to, things like grasses and some trees. But the vast majority of flowering plants, the vast majority of plants on the planet require an animal to move their pollen and reproduce. So just thinking about that number of plants that depend on these animals to reproduce is really striking. So going into the specifics of that, that means a lot of our food is dependent on animal pollinators. So we like to say 1 in every 3 bites of food we take is thanks to a pollinator. About 35% of global crop production relies on animal pollinators. And this includes a lot of really wonderful foods we eat that we depend on that bring nutrition to our diets and put color on our plates. So things like berries, apples, avocados, squash, almonds, really important things like coffee and chocolate and so much more. Not only are pollinators essential to feeding us, but they're also essential to feeding animals that depend on the fruits and seeds of wild plants in our natural ecosystem. So those fruits and seeds from our native plants that birds and other animals are eating are usually produced thanks to pollinators. So that's one way pollinators are feeding animals, but they're also food themselves. So specifically caterpillars, butterflies and moths are really important food sources for many wildlife, including 89% of birds. So lots of birds are eating these caterpillars. Lots of other animals depend on flying moths. Lots of other animals eat bees and all the other insects that are pollinating plants. This includes birds to fish, bats, bears, just about all kinds of different wildlife are eating pollinators themselves or depending on the plants that pollinators help reproduce. So what is a pollinator? So you probably know of a couple vertebrate pollinators, so pollinators that have a backbone, things like hummingbirds and some bats, more southern New Mexico. There are bats that pollinate things like agave, but really the bulk of pollination is done by insects or invertebrates. So insects don't have a backbone, and they include some things that you're probably very familiar with, like bees and butterflies, but there are also other really major groups of insect pollinators like moths, wasps, beetles, and flies. So all of these different insects are visiting flowers to drink nectar from flowers. They're sustaining their adult life form by drinking nectar from flowers and picking up pollen on their body to go drink nectar from another flower results in pollination. Some beetles eat pollen, but specifically one of these pollinators is really, really great at pollination, and that is our bees. They are the most important and efficient pollinator due to a few reasons. So while those other insects are usually visiting flowers to drink nectar and eat maybe some pollen, bees specifically are packing pollen onto their bodies to take back to a nest. So those other insects, they might incidentally pick up some pollen on their body, but bees are actively collecting and transporting pollen on their body. So they have a lot more pollen on them compared to, say, a butterfly. Another thing that makes them really great at pollination is that they exhibit flower constancy, which means once they know their way around one type of flower, one species of flower, they prefer to go to that flower in the same foraging trip. So they will visit the same type of flower, resulting in pollination. So if they went to a different species, those pollen types wouldn't be compatible, and there would be no reproduction. So because they prefer to go to that same type of flower, they result in pollination. Another thing to think about with bees is that they forage in an area around a nest. So these female bees specifically are collecting pollen on their bodies to take back to their nests, which will feed their babies. And because they're foraging intensively in that area around their nest, they are really improving the seed set of the plants located in that area. So plants in an area where nesting bees are located are really receiving great pollination thanks to these bees that are intensively visiting those flowers. And when most people think of bees, they think of honeybees. So you think of queens and workers, you think of honey and a hive, but this is a very unique bee species. So specifically, the European honeybee is a social bee. So it does have that queen and workers in a hive. There's a large amount of bees in a single hive. And that's really unique in the bee world, actually. They're also perennial. Most bees live on an annual life cycle or a very short life cycle, but honeybees can live for multiple years. A hive can live multiple years. And another major thing to consider about honeybees is that they are a managed livestock species. So honeybees, the European honeybee, was introduced to the United States by colonists from Europe. So they are not a native species in the US, and they are mostly kept as livestock animals and used in our agricultural systems to pollinate crops. So there are folks that have mobile hives that move them across different parts of the country to supplement pollination in our intensive agricultural areas across the United States. And they are kept also by backyard beekeepers for honey. So they're really kind of more like a livestock agricultural animal compared to our wild bees. So just keep in mind that honeybees, even though you probably heard of colony collapse disorder, they are affected by a lot of the same things our wild bees are affected by. Since they're not native to the US and since they are kept by humans, they are not a threat of extinction. There are more honeybees on Earth right now than there ever have been. So we have a lot more bees to think about. So it's more than honeybees. There are 3,600 known species of bees in the United States. And they're very different from honeybees. Most of them are solitary, so about 70% are solitary. The other bee that you're probably familiar with is the bumblebee. And those bees are native to the United States. There's almost 50 species of those, one species of honeybee, and then thousands more of these different other native wild bees. And they're split up into different families. They have very different life cycles. And one thing I want to mention is that even though we really rely on honeybees in our agricultural system, in our heavily industrialized agricultural system, native bees are also very important and efficient crop pollinators as well. So a lot of these native bees are actually better at pollinating. Some of our orchard bees that are native can pollinate more fruit trees and provide better fruit set than honeybee colonies. So just keep in mind that there are so many different families and types of native bees, and they live very different lives from honeybees. And one way they live quite differently is in how they nest. So honeybees live in a hive with workers and a queen and build cells where they keep their babies. And we have some native bees that live like that. So our social cavity nesting bees are our bumblebees, and that's about 1% of our native bees. They also have a similar hive with a queen and workers. They're active throughout the growing season. So you'll see them in early spring until late fall. And they are usually nesting in places like abandoned rodent burrows, little cavities in the ground, like cavities underneath bunch grasses. That's what they use. Then another huge chunk of our native bees are stem or tunnel nesting bees, and that's about 30% of our native bee species. So they're using hollow stems of plants, they're tunneling into wooden holes, things like that. And then the vast majority of our bees are ground nesting bees, where they will dig nests directly into the soil and create little cells in the soil, lay their eggs there, and provide that with the pollen they're collecting from flowers. And another thing I want to mention about the diversity of bees is that there are some that are very picky and some that aren't. So we have generalist bees, which collect pollen from all available flowers. They will collect pollen from whatever they can to feed their babies. So this includes honeybees and bumblebees. Because they're active all year round, they can't be really picky because they just have to use whatever happens to be in bloom across the different seasons. And a lot of our other native bees are generalists too. So planting just about any plants that produce pollen are beneficial to them. Then we have another group of bees called specialists. And these bees are very picky about what they feed their babies. They will only collect pollen from a certain type of plant to take back to their nest. And one really interesting thing about New Mexico is that almost half of our bee species, native wild bee species, are specialists. That means they depend on a certain type of plant to feed their babies. So this bottom picture is of a squash bee. So we have squash bees that are specialist native bees in the Southwest that only collect pollen from squash plants. So things like coyote gourds and all of your garden squash plants. So there's also cactus bees, sunflower bees, globe mallow bees, just a giant list of these specialist bees, specifically in New Mexico and across the globe. One really exciting thing about working in pollinator conservation in the Southwest is that we have a really high diversity of bees. So this heat map shows some research where they mapped bee diversity across the globe, and species richness just means the number of species. So that light yellow color means very few species, and then the dark is a lot of species. So you can see the desert Southwest has a lot of species in New Mexico, Arizona area. We have about 1,000 species in New Mexico, which is over a quarter of the whole United States bee diversity. So a lot of wonderful potential to conserve bees in this place where we have such amazing diversity. So you've probably heard that pollinators, insects in general, are in decline. And this is probably pretty alarming considering how important they are to feeding us and sustaining our ecosystems. So what research has found is that pollinators, including bees, butterflies, other insect pollinators, are in decline across the globe in different ecosystems. So And we're also seeing that they're declining in abundance and diversity. So we're seeing fewer species at certain sites, and we're seeing fewer individuals of really common species. So we're seeing declines across the gamut of these different pollinating insects. We're seeing declines, or at least hive loss, in honeybee populations too. And we're also documenting that these declines are affecting the plant populations that depend on pollinators. So this is probably pretty alarming that these pollinators are in decline, but let's talk about why that is happening. There are a few major threats to pollinators to talk about. One being, I think, probably the most critical is habitat loss. So this means the loss of resources that pollinators need to complete their life cycle. So they're losing the food, the nesting habitat that they need to keep reproducing and sustain a population. And this occurs in large swaths where we're converting land to agricultural use and not leaving any habitat for pollinators to use. And it occurs in urbanization, where we're removing pollinator habitat to build human infrastructure. Another is pesticides. So the use of pesticides negatively impacts pollinators in a lot of ways, directly and indirectly. And that can be in large scale agricultural use, to home garden use, to use in nurseries, in plants that might be planted for pollinators. The next is disease in non-native species. So those honeybees that we move around the country can spread disease to our native pollinators. So that's another major threat. And finally, climate change, that ties directly into habitat loss. As climate change changes our ecosystems, as plants are dying out at as temperatures rise and as precipitation becomes less predictable, those resources are lost for pollinators. And there's also a disconnect between timing as temperatures rise. So spring is tending to happen earlier, plants may bloom earlier, but are those pollinating insects emerging earlier and matching that timing of natural events? But the good news is we can address these risks. So a lot of these risks are based on our human behaviors, and we can change our behaviors to address them by conserving and creating habitat, reducing our reliance on pesticides, reducing risks from managed pollinator species, and planning for species and habitat diversity to address climate change. So what we're going to talk about is addressing that habitat loss piece. How can we create habitat in our yards? And there's some main elements to consider when you're thinking about planting for pollinators, or creating habitat for pollinators, I should say. The first being they need food. So this includes flowers that are producing nectar and pollen for many pollinators to use, as well as host plants. So host plants are the plants that butterflies and moth caterpillars rely on to eat, for them to eat specifically as caterpillars, and then they'll use those flowers as adults. The next being shelter, where they have an area that's undisturbed, where they can nest and overwinter during their dormant stages of life. So creating structure, leaving habitat, nesting areas for those pollinators to use that won't be disturbed. And finally, safety. So protection from pesticides is another key element in providing habitat for pollinators. And with that, I will pass it on to Emily Ruth, who will give us a lot of more information about pesticides.
All right. Okay, so hello, everybody. My name is Emily. I introduced myself earlier, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about pesticides for the next few slides. So we're going to start really simple with just some basic definitions. What is a pest and what is a pesticide? So a pest is any unwanted living thing. But I want you guys to remember that this is context dependent. So if you have an ant in your backyard that's aerating the soil, that might not be a pest, but an ant that's hanging out in your house and causing problems for you, that's a pest. So we got to remember that it's context dependent. And pests are addressed with pesticides. So pesticides are any substance used for getting rid of pests. So you can see in these pictures below, these are all pests, and that ranges from insects like aphids to plants to rats to birds, and they're treated with all these different kinds of pesticides. And remember that pesticide, that word is an umbrella term, and this means that it covers all of these different kinds of chemicals. It's not just insecticides. So I wanted to share some facts with you guys that I found surprising when I first started working at Xerces. So there are over 500 active ingredients of pesticides. There are even more inert ingredients that are not disclosed. So when you go to the store and you're looking at these pesticides on the shelf, there's actually several ingredients that aren't even listed anywhere on that packaging, and that's because they're allowed to keep these as business secrets from the consumers. There are over 20,000 formulations of pesticides, and each one of these drugs is a different formulation, basically. And in the US, we use over 1 billion pounds of active ingredient per year. But remember that active ingredient is usually a very small percentage of what's in those drugs. And finally, about 25% of insecticides are in home use. And that's something that we have control over if you have a backyard. So I'm hoping that by the end of my talk, we'll be able to reduce pesticide use in that home use and get that percentage down. So I wanted to share with you guys the idea of the pesticide paradigm, because it's kind of the circumstances that we're living in. So here's the definition: the unspoken and almost unconscious assumption by industry, state, and the public that chemical pesticides are absolutely necessary, safe, and effective. And the more that I learn about pesticides, the more that I think that none of those adjectives are really true. And I hope to convince you of that in the next few slides. So this image is of the Colorado potato beetle. And this beetle is a very problematic pest because it likes to eat the foliage of potato plants. And when all the foliage is gone, they can't produce the tuber that the potato that we want to eat underground. So we really have to control this pest. And agriculturalists have been using pesticides to try to control it for a really long time. But the problem is that it keeps developing resistance. So how does this happen? So the Colorado potato beetle, like a lot of pests, will have several generations, one after the other, and will have tons and tons and tons of offspring. That's part of the reason we find them a problem. But when they do that, there's also the chance that a mutation might show up in that population. So when a mutation shows up, that might give a beetle resistance to a pesticide that's being applied to the population. And if that pesticide is taking out all the rest of the beetles, when the one that has the mutation is able to reproduce, every generation after is going to have more and more of that mutation until the whole entire population has that gene. So what this means is that when a mutation like that pops up, a whole entire population can become resistant to the chemicals that we're applying. And the problem is this keeps happening over and over again. So we describe this as a pesticide treadmill, where basically we have an over-reliance on pesticides, and then the beetles, in this case, would develop resistance. And then we apply more pesticides, but the beetles will keep developing resistance because that's what they do. That's how the evolution works. And we're finding this to be more of a problem too, because they're starting to get resistance to pesticides that haven't even been applied yet, because the pesticides that are being developed have similarities to the old ones. So this is my first example of just a problem in pesticides that maybe they're not as effective as we think that they are. So my next example is that pesticides harm natural enemies of pests. So natural enemies are things like predators, like the convergent lady beetle, which I wanted to include in this presentation because I've seen these lady beetles around all over the place in Santa Fe. They're really great. They'll eat all of the aphids in your backyard, which is fabulous. But also, convergent lady beetles aren't the only ones that control pests. There are also, like this taconid fly, parasites and parasitoids. And I don't have the time to talk about the biology and life cycle of those, although it is incredibly fascinating and horrifying. And there's also pathogens that work to control pests. So my point here is that if you're applying a pesticide in your backyard, you're not just going to be getting rid of the aphids and the small pests. You're going to be getting rid of all of the other beneficial insects too, including these natural enemies that would already be taking care of those pests. So applying the pesticide is kind of like shooting yourself in the foot. So I want you guys to remember that about 98% of insects are not pests at all, but contributing to your backyard ecosystem. So my third point here, that pesticides are maybe not as great as we think, is that less than 1% of the pesticide reaches the target pest. So what happens to the remaining 99%? So this person is spraying this chemical in the picture, and a lot of that is going to get on the plants, it's going to get on the ground, and it's going to be carried by the air. So my first example here is that pesticides can travel when you apply them. So that remaining 90%, it might get taken up by the wind and carried to other plants that are nearby or someone else's yard. They might get mixed in with water, and then they can travel to wherever that water is going. Or sometimes pesticides even adhere to soil particles. And when they do that, they'll go anywhere that the soil is going. So pesticides don't stay where you apply them. They can travel, and they can impact a whole lot of creatures when they do that. So when they travel, they end up places that we really don't want them. So here's some examples that we've found pesticides in natural habitat on crop margins and agricultural land. We found pesticides in honeybee hives and in their food. We've found pesticides in soils that could harm soil invertebrates. And we find them in rivers and streams, which I want you guys to note this percentage here, that 90% of rivers in urban areas contain pesticides at levels risky to aquatic life. That's 90%. That's a really high percentage. So we need to start doing something in our urban areas differently. So I want to start talking a little bit more about pollinators, since this is about pollinator gardening. And the first thing you need to know is about exposure, because if a pollinator isn't exposed to a pesticide, it can't really be harmed by it. But if it is exposed, there's a whole range of consequences. So the first way that a pollinator can be exposed is by direct contact. So it's basically just this picture, that if you're going to spray a pesticide right on a pollinator, it's probably going to be exposed to the pesticide and have issues. But some less obvious ones are indirect contact. So this middle one. So if you're spraying a flower that has resources for a pollinator, that pollinator might come to the flower and be touching that pollen and nectar on the flower and get the chemicals all over itself. So that's a form of indirect contact exposure. And then I've got some more complex examples of indirect contact too. So for example, in this case down here, this pollinator might be a leafcutter bee, which is visiting this plant and is going to take a chunk of this leaf and take it back to its nest and line the walls with it. It's really cool. But the problem here is if we spray that plant with chemicals, then when that leafcutter bee comes back to get a new chunk of that leaf, it's going to get covered in chemicals and it's going to be contaminated, and its nest is going to be contaminated. So its babies will be exposed as well. So that's not great. And then our other example here of indirect contact is if any pesticide that you spray gets on the ground, because as Kaitlin was just saying, a lot of our bees are ground nesting bees. So if there's pesticides all over the soil, then when they're digging around and excavating their nest, they're going to be exposed via contact that way. So these are all examples of indirect contact. There's one more I want to talk about that's just a teeny bit more complicated. You might have heard of systemic pesticides. And the idea with systemic pesticides is that they treat the whole plant. But the problem is, if they get mixed with water, they're very soluble, and the water can go to your pollinator garden. And if that water is taken up by your pollinator plants, that chemical will be distributed to all of the tissues of the plant. So this includes the roots, the stems, the leaves, the pollen, the nectar, everything. And this is a big problem because if that bee is going to come and take some nectar and pollen from that plant, it's going to be orally exposed. It's going to ingest that pesticide by eating that pollen and nectar, and it's going to have that chemical in its body. And similarly, if there are any caterpillars that are feeding on the leaves of this plant, they would also be ingesting that chemical. So now we're going to talk about what happens when pollinators are exposed to pesticides. And I apologize if this picture is kind of sad, but this is from my thesis research, so I really wanted to share it with you guys. So a couple things can happen. If it's a low concentration of pesticide, there's a chance that the pollinator might be okay, but it's more likely that they will end up with mortality or sublethal effects. So mortality is just what it sounds like. It's just the pollinator will die, which is really sad. But whether it dies or not can depend on a whole lot of things, like which pesticide it is, how high the concentration is, the species of pollinator. There's even individual variation, and environmental factors can come into this too, so it's very complicated. But the example that I wanted to show you is this caterpillar. Oops, go back. This caterpillar right here. So this is a painted lady butterfly caterpillar, and it's trying to turn into a chrysalis. But what happened is it has been orally ingesting pesticides for my thesis research, and unfortunately, it's not going to make it. It's trying to turn into a chrysalis, but it's only got its head that's turned into it, and the rest of it is just not going to transform, so it's going to die. And this is an example of mortality because of a pesticide. But I also want to talk to you guys about sublethal effects. These can be just as dangerous as mortality. So here's a big old list of things that can happen to a pollinator when exposed to a pesticide. And I want you to keep in mind that these are all based on honeybees. So we don't really know exactly how every pesticide is going to affect every pollinator. And an example of this in my research was that my painted lady butterflies, when exposed to high concentrations of pesticides, had very small body mass. And this can be a really big problem because painted ladies are migratory butterflies. And if they don't have enough fat stores, they might not be able to make it through their whole migration without starving. So again, sublethal effects can be just as bad as the lethal effects. So this slide is to tell you guys that I've been talking about pesticides this whole time, but remember that it's an umbrella term and that pesticides include fungicides and herbicides, and we should be avoiding all of them because they can all have really bad impacts on pollinators. And specifically, mixing them can be a problem. So with fungicides and insecticides, if both of them are in your backyard and your pollinator is exposed, there could be synergy. And what this means is that the fungicide and the insecticide might affect the pollinator on their own additively, but they also act multiplicatively. And this means that they make each other more dangerous for the pollinator when combined. And when this happens, you can have results like a pollinator has a reduced ability to fight off disease. So super important not to mix chemicals because it's increasingly dangerous. And also that pesticides are really bad for lots of other animals besides just pollinators, including people. So we don't want anyone to be harmed by pesticides. Unfortunately, we don't have all of the information about how pesticides are going to impact pollinators or people. So we've got to use the precautionary principle. And this just means that we should just be careful about our pesticide use if we don't know all the consequences on the environment. So one thing that's really special about home gardening is that you get to choose how you're going to design your yard so that it may need less pesticides and you can have a chemical-free place. So real quickly, I have a few ideas for you of ways to avoid pesticides in your yard. So the first one is called right plant, right place. And the idea here is that plants have preferences. Sometimes they like drier soils or wetter soil or more sun or less sun. And Dana's going to cover this with a lot more depth in just a minute. But when you put plants in places that they like, they have less pests. How cool is that? So you want to make sure that you're putting plants in a place that they're happy, and then you won't have so many issues. An example of this is if you have just the right amount of water for your plants and good airflow in your garden, you won't have a mildew problem and you don't need a fungicide. So even if you never spray pesticides in your yard, there's still a chance that pesticides could sneak into it. So I wanted to share some ways that this could happen. The first is that if you have a neighbor that's spraying a bunch of pesticides, there could be drift. That pesticide could follow the wind right into your yard. So that's no good. So we realized that reducing pesticide use has to be a community-wide effort. Also, the perimeter or foundation of homes are often treated with pesticides to prevent structural pests like ants and termites. So you might not want to plant things too close to the sides of your house, just in case of that. Also, tree doctors that come see your sick trees will often use pesticides, either by injecting into the trunk or soaking the tree in a drench. And both of these are bad because trees can hold pesticides for a really, really long time. And you don't want your pollinators to be exposed to flowers or leaves on that tree that have that pesticide in them. And finally, when you're buying plants from nurseries, make sure to net your plants in your first year. This is because nurseries actually use quite a bit of pesticides too. You have to be really careful about where you buy your plants. But if they still have the pesticides in them, then you want to make sure that your pollinators aren't visiting for the first year. And the reason why I say a year is because the pesticide needs time to degrade. And when it does that, then the plants will be safe.
Wow.
So my last note for you guys is just that you want to buy Be Safe plants. Keep an eye out for our label. We're hoping that it will spread. And yeah, seek out organic plants and seeds whenever you can. Avoid things grown with neonicotinoids and other systemic insecticides. And just talk to your nursery. Ask them if they're using pesticides or not. Because the more that we tell nurseries that we want chemical-free plants, the more they'll supply. So thank you guys, and I'll pass it over to Dana. Get ready for an amazing rest of the talk.
Hi, everyone. I am going to work on sharing my screen just a second. Okay. Whoop. Sorry. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Can everybody hear me? So I'm gonna buzz through how to actually get your pollinator garden in the ground and successful. And I want to encourage anyone to plant pollinator plants and create pollinator habitat. Even if you have an apartment balcony, you can plant things in pots. And also, if you're in the Santa Fe area, Kaitlin will be doing her habitat kits again this year as part of the pollinator trail. And that is such an amazing resource where you get this area specific plants that are great for pollinators. It's a wonderful program. We're going to look at site assessment, design, site preparation, plants and planting, irrigation, and site maintenance. First, you want to assess the site that you're going to be working with, even if you're looking at your patio. You want to see how big your site is, what your exposure is. Do you have sun, shade, or a combination? Even in the desert here, we can have a backyard that is completely shaded by an enormous apricot tree. So just because we are sunny and hot here doesn't mean that you have sun for your plants. You want to look at your soil, what kind of soil you have. Are there already plants there that you're going to be working around? a lot of gardens here have cottonwoods and aspen trees, which are water hogs and also use up a lot of the good soil. So you're going to have to take that into consideration when you're designing your garden. And then even though these plants that we're recommending are drought tolerant, they do need water, and particularly for the first 3 years. So you want to look at water availability and how easy is it going to be to get it to your garden. Does your site have microclimates? Do you have a wall around your garden that might be making it warmer than your neighbors? Or is your house shading it? And are there any hazards? You want to be sure you're not putting in a tree that's going to grow up into power lines. You want to know if you have a septic system, you don't want deep rooting plants. So just thinking about those things, drawing up a sketch so that you have an idea of where everything is will really help when you get to the design stage. And then sun mapping. Sun is really important, whether you're getting a lot of it or you have plants that want just a little bit of sun. This is something you want to really take time and watch the area that you're going to be planting. The sun moves throughout the day, so an area that might be in full sun until 10 in the morning could be in full shade by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And it also changes with the seasons of the year. So my backyard has sun all afternoon right now, but in the winter, there's a side of my yard that never gets sun and things stay frozen all winter long. So taking the time to really watch where the sun is and draw up a sketch that shows where you have sun and where you have shade. And then there's a fun app if you have kids who like apps, or if you like apps, it's called the Sunseeker app, and I've put that in the resources. Soil, of course, is really important because that's what your plant is going to be growing in. And so you do need to know what kind of soil you have. Do you have clay? Do you have sand? Do you have humus-rich, silty soil, or a combination? And you can do a very easy test where you just take a handful of soil, squeeze it in your hands, make it a ball, and then poke your finger into it. And if it falls apart immediately, you probably have a lot of sand in your soil. If it sticks together and holds its shape, you probably have more clay. But the mason jar soil test, which I don't have time to tell you about, but I put in the resources, that is a more in-depth test and really fun to do with kids as well. And then does your soil hold water, or does it just drain right through? If it's really sandy, it probably is just draining right through. And this is very important when you're looking at irrigating your soil. The percolation test, I've put a link for, but it's basically just digging a hole in your soil, filling it with water, and then timing how quickly the water dissipates. For soil fertility, which is the vitamins, the nutrition in the soil, one really easy way is to just take a shovel full of soil and look to see if you have any earthworms in your soil. They're a great indicator of fertility. And I'm going to give you a trick for bringing in more worms into your soil a little bit later. And then a really fun, I love chemistry, so getting the pH of your soil, you can do with a simple pH meter like the one shown here. Or if you really want to have fun, you can get a home pH chemistry test. And that's another great thing to do with kids. And it'll tell you whether your soil is acidic, or if it's base, or if it's somewhere in the middle. 7 tends to be really perfect for a lot of plants, but there are plants that love to be growing in acidic soil and other ones that like to be in really sweet soil. So when I'm talking to clients about designing their garden, there are lots of things I want them to think about. I give them homework because I love all plants. And so it'd be really hard for me to narrow it down. But when you're designing your pollinator garden, one thing to think about is what kind of pollinators do you want to attract? Maybe you want to attract all pollinators, and that's great. But maybe you have a preference for hummingbirds. And so you want to think about plants that attract hummingbirds, like penstemons. Think about what colors you like. I'm really fond of chartreuse and purple and deep red and yellow together. Those just really light me up. But maybe you like orange and yellow and blue. So there are plants in almost any color you can imagine. So thinking about those colors and how they're going to go together in the garden. And what kinds of plants do you like? A lot of people love cactus, and other people like really big flowered, showy plants. And are they going to grow in your site, which you're going to be narrowing down because you'll know how much sun you have and what kind of soil you have by now. How much space can you dedicate to the garden? Maybe you have a 5-acre parcel, but maybe all you can dedicate to the garden is going to be a 1/4 acre, which is a huge space, but how much can you dedicate? What already is there, and can you incorporate it into your design, or are you going to have to get rid of it? How much time can you invest in this? Trees and shrubs tend to take less time for maintenance, but annuals and perennials, which flower more, could take more time for maintenance and for replanting. Also, the more plants you have, the more time it's going to take. And then think about bloom times. Flowers and trees and shrubs bloom at different times of the year. And you want to have as much bloom as possible for as long as possible. Winter interest, things like red twig dogwood are beautiful in the winter with their red stems, and also of benefit to birds. Different plants are a benefit to birds. Some have berries, and I have some plants to share with you that have berries. And then the pollinator usage of the plants, obviously, and height considerations. How big can things get in your space? View sheds, where are you going to be looking at the garden from? But also, if you're planting in your garden, say in a sidewalk strip, you want to make sure you're not putting plants that are going to block your view when you're trying to enter traffic from your driveway. Accessibility, do you want to get in your garden, or are you going to look at it from a distance or from the outside? And also, are you going to be able to get in there to put compost or mulch or to water? And if you live like in El Dorado or somewhere with an HOA, you want to find out what their rules are and make sure that you're staying within those rules so you don't have to take plants out once you have them in. We just bought a house in White Rock last year, and this picture on the left is what the backyard was when I got here. And most of that is goat's head. And so I wanted to get rid of that seed bank so that I didn't step on those nasty little thorns all the time. So I weeded everything. This was at the height of the pandemic, or when everybody was gardening, so you couldn't get a tractor, which turned out to be really good because I did the whole thing by hand. I took up all the flagstone that was there and all the rock, and then started creating the shape of the beds. I want a low maintenance garden here because we may sell the house, and so I didn't want to leave someone with too much garden. And I also wanted to see what weeds were going to come up that first year. So I just created peripheral kind of small beds. This on this picture is this first spring. Everything made it through the winter except for the things the gophers ate. And And I've sort of staggered my plan where the first year I put in trees and shrubs and some bigger perennials so that I could get them established and also see the weeds when they come up. And now this year I'm doing more of a prairie area in here with wildflowers that I'm sowing by seed. Some design tips when you're planting: organize the plants in groups of the same species. This is both because it looks nice. Also, those plants are going to need the same water, soil, and light, but also because it gives the pollinators a helping hand. It takes a lot of energy for them to move distances. So the more they have the plant they want all in one group, the easier it is for them. Also, planting in layers where you have shorter plants in the front and taller plants in the back. That is both nice to look at, but it also makes sure that those shorter plants aren't getting shaded out or hidden by the taller plants. And it also creates structure for the garden. If you have space, plant for a variety of pollinators. If you have a small space, I would recommend planting just a number of the same plant or a few types of plants, but numbers of them. And you want to think about providing food for all stages of the pollinator development. Most pollinators have a larval stage and then their adult stage where they're collecting pollen and nectar, and then overwintering shelter. I would suggest, if you're new to this, that you start with nursery plants rather than sowing seed, because seed is tricky. And I'll give you some tips on sowing seed, but most of it doesn't germinate, either because it dries out at some point, or the birds eat it, or it's not where it wants to be because it's a mix. So seeds can be tricky. Nursery plants are easier, they're already established, and also it makes it easier for weeding because you'll see the little weeds coming up. You can mix container planting with in-ground planting. So if you have some plants that need a richer soil and more water, you can put those in containers where you can give them special attention. And keep in mind that many herb, vegetable, and weed plants are also great pollinator plants. Natives, we really like natives because our native pollinators have co-evolved with those native plants, and we're conserving native plant biodiversity at the same time. But things like brassicas that overwinter and bloom very early provide early nectar. Lots of generalists will use lavender, and then some things that you think are weeds are actually wonderful pollinator plants like dandelions. And in my case, there were some things that I wasn't too sure of when I was going on my weed rampage, and I left them. And I ended up with this Asclepias subverticillata right here that has a tarantula hawk wasp, which was enormous. And then these little native gowras, and this is a hummingbird moth that comes every evening and benefits from that. So leaving things that you don't quite fit with your design, but are already there, can bring great reward. For site preparation, think about timing, like I'm doing mine in kind of a 3-year stage to make it a little more manageable, and how much you can manage at one time, the scale, weed removal and long-term maintenance, and whether or not you'll amend the soil. Most native plants prefer the native soil. They don't want a nitrogen-rich soil, so that's the good news. You generally don't have to amend. Whether you're going to be planting in containers or straight in the ground will affect how you're preparing your site. When you're doing all of that, you want to be looking at how you're going to install your irrigation. You'll plant, put your irrigation down, and cover with mulch. And here, Reunity Resources has a great mulch that doesn't have any manure added to it or additional nitrogen. So it's really good for these pollinator gardens. I used sheet mulching rather than weed cloth. Having been a gardener for 35 years in other people's gardens, I have come across a lot of horrible weed cloth and plastic that people put down. And weeds just grow right through it eventually. It cracks, it breaks, or weeds blow in on top of it. And it's very difficult to weed once it's there. It's also really hard to plant into if you are doing your garden in stages. So I'm not a big fan of weed cloth. It goes right into the landfill and it does absolutely nothing for your soil. So what I did in my garden is I put down cardboard. We had just moved, so we had a lot of cardboard, but the recycling centers will often let you take cardboard as well. And you can also use newspaper. So you can put that straight down on grass. If you have tap-rooted plants like deep roots, you should dig those out first because they'll punch up through the cardboard. And then I just put the Reunity Resources mulch on top of that once I planted. And this year I have beautiful soil under there and no weeds. And the little tip is that earthworms adore cardboard. It has cellulose sugars in it and they're really drawn to it. So it does help to keep the cardboard a little bit moist so it'll break down in a year or two, but it makes beautiful soil, as you can see. When you're planting, if you're using nursery starts, you want to make sure that the soil in the pot is level with the soil in your garden. If the plant is planted too deep, like above the level of the soil in the pot, it'll rot the trunk of the plant. If it's too shallow and the roots are sticking up above the ground, the plant will dry out. And it might not die right away, but it'll die the first time it gets stressed. So it needs to be level with your garden soil. When you put the plant in and you fill in around the hole, you want to tap down on that or step around the perimeter to make sure the soil gets really settled in around it and gets rid of air bubbles, and also lets you see if you really are at the same level with the garden soil, or if in fact your plant is too deep, as often happens. I water where I'm going to plant before I plant. I dig my hole, I water, I put the plant in, I fill it in with soil, and I water it again. If the roots have air bubbles around them or they get hot, then they can't access water and they'll get stressed. For annuals and perennials, if you're buying nursery stock, a 2 to 4 inch pot is just as good as a gallon pot, maybe better. For trees and shrubs, I would say go with a bigger pot, like a 5 gallon or 10 gallon. A lot of our native trees and shrubs are pretty slow growing, so giving them a good start is helpful. Seed sowing, I promised I would give you some tips on this. I would recommend starting with annual seeds if you really want to sow seeds. In New Mexico, we typically sow in the fall so that the seeds benefit from our winter moisture and snow. I mix my seed with dry, clean sand. A lot of these seeds are little or they kind of clump together. So if you put them in dry sand, you get a more even distribution and you can see where you've already seeded. I lightly rough up the area 1 to 3 inches with a hard rake, or you can use a garden fork. And that is so the seed has somewhere to land and stick. Because if you just keep the soil surface smooth, first time you water or we have a hard rain, all the seed washes off. If you've done the sheet mulching and you're sowing into that soil, you probably won't need to do this because it'll be nice friable soil. When you're doing that, rake aside a good amount of the soil to cover the seed after you sow it. And most seed, you're only going to cover 1/4 of an inch or so. Then you water the area before sowing. That gives the seeds a nice place to land and stick, and so they're not too hot. Be generous with your seed sowing. A lot of these seeds are not going to germinate, so overseed. And then cover them with the soil you set aside and water them really good. When these start to germinate in the spring, you need to keep the area moist because the little babies will die immediately if they dry out until they get established. Any remaining seeds, you want to store it in a cool, dry location. And then collecting native seed in the late summer and fall is a great way to have locally appropriate seed for your garden. But there are ethical ways to do that. And I've put that in the resources, but in a nutshell, we want to leave as much genetic diversity in the wild as possible. So you only want to collect a few seeds from each plant. You never want to collect all the seeds from any one plant or any few plants. Remember that everything needs water. These plants are going to need water for at least for the first 3 years. Your bees, butterflies, other insects, and birds also need water to survive. You can just put like a little dish out in your garden with a flat rock in it so that the bees and butterflies and things can access the water without drowning. And they need clean, fresh water. Old water can get bacteria in it, which will kill the insects as well. So keep it clean and fresh. If you don't want to drink it, they probably shouldn't be drinking it. I use emitter irrigation. I do 2 short 10-minute watering cycles twice a day. And my pipe gives mine give 1/2 gallon of water per hour, but you can do 1/2 gallon to 1 gallon of water per hour. So it's really efficient. I cover my pipe with mulch. I don't leave it on the surface like this to reduce evaporation. And seeded areas need broader watering. So you're going to have to water with a spray end on your hose, or you can use a sprinkler, but it wastes a lot of water. This is the kind of emitter that I use. I get mine from DripWorks, and it's just 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch. And I wind mine through my beds, not around like that. I put it closer to the plants that need more water and farther away from the plants that need less water. And if you're planting in groupings, you can also plant the things that need a little more water together and make sure they're going to get more. And then lastly, maintaining for pollinators is a little bit different from how we've historically maintained for manicured gardens. And I always say you need to practice a tolerance for just a little bit more messiness. These are going to look a bit wild, these gardens. You can help your neighbors understand what you're doing with Xerces signs. Xerces has great signs that talk about pollinator habitat and why it looks a little messier. And when I say messy, it's because like for the stem nesting bees, we don't want to be cutting back all the flowers in the fall. We want to leave the stems for those bees. We don't want to rake up all the leaves and have a super clean area because a lot of the pollinators are going to overwinter under the leaves. But you can rake your leaves to the margins of your garden, and that serves 2 purposes. One, you won't be walking on those overwintering insects, and you can have an area that looks neater. You want to leave areas of bare soil in your garden for the ground nesting bees, and some of them use mud for their nests. So allowing for some areas that get a little muddy is really helpful to them. And then look out for invasive weeds that might compete with your natives. And there's a great website called invasive.org, and it'll show you the weed plants at all stages of their development. So getting familiar with what your native plants look like when they're babies and what your weeds look like when they're babies will really help you with maintaining and weeding. And these, just because they're so cute, are some diagrams of the ground nesting bees, the stem nesting bees, some areas of leaves in the winter where they'll hide under. And then quickly, I have about 10 more minutes to go through these 20 superstar plants. I had the hardest time choosing because I love all of them, and we have such a diversity of plants here. But these are ones that I think have great benefit for pollinators, and they're easy to grow and really pretty. We'll start with a few annuals because those are kind of instant gratification. They complete their life cycle in one season, so you're going to get flowers this year. They can generate a seed bank for you in 1 year, and they're early sources of nectar, pollen, and larval food. And a lot of them, like the asters, have seeds in the fall, and the birds love those. One great plant is the Helianthus annuus, the annual sunflower. This can be a bit of a monster. It gets up to 8 feet tall. It has 5-inch yellow flower heads that are just pollen and nectar factories. They make so much. They bloom July to October, and there's a whole thing about what pollinators like in their plants, but a flat landing surface is great for butterflies. So they love these sunflowers. And they have big leaves, which caterpillars can use, and then seeds at the end of the summer that birds love. They are very low water. They don't need much water, but if it's there, they'll drink it. So I would suggest planting them kind of on their own along the back of a border, along a fence or something. They're super cheerful and beautiful. The Rocky Mountain bee plant is one of my favorites. It's really showy, as you can see. The hummingbirds love it. It gets 2 to 4 feet tall by 1 foot. It attracts native bees and honeybees. It's a larval host to checkered white butterfly. It doesn't need much water. It loves the sun. I would put it towards the back of a border, and it blooms in the summer. Desert marigold is another great, technically perennial, but it's very short-lived, so I'm putting it in with the annuals. It has these great yellow flowers, gets 18 to 20 inches tall, and it'll clump in 12-inch clumps. Blooms most of the summer. It's of special value to our native bees. It'll take full sun to partial shade. So if you have a part of your garden that only has sun in the morning or the afternoon, this would be a good choice. It will grow in almost any kind of soil, including clay, and I would put it towards the front of the border. Perennials are the workhorses of the garden. They come back year after year. They often will spread or clump or even reseed. You don't need to replant them every year. And a lot of them have stems that offer nesting sites, or they'll have foliage that persists all winter, and that's great protection for pollinators. And any of Asclepias species, we have so many in New Mexico, and Xerces has a great milkweed finder tool that is for the entire country. So that's a great place. But the two I'm including you can find in nurseries. The showy butterfly weed is just what its name implies. It's really showy. Flowers in the spring to summer. Monarch butterflies love it. Native bees, bumblebees, and hummingbirds will also use it. Asclepias tuberosa is another one that you'll find in nurseries. It's super showy. Again, another butterfly plant. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to rush a little. The native clovers are great for pollinators. They fix nitrogen, which means they take nitrogen from the air and make it available in the soil to other plants. So they're great if you have really poor soil. The eriogonums, this is James buckwheat, and this is a nectar source for the rare Spalding dotted blue butterfly. It also makes a lot of seeds at the end of the season. Birds love that. My favorite is the sulfur buckwheat, which is this chartreuse yellow. It can grow anywhere from 3 inches to 3 feet tall, will grow in gravel, and it attracts native bees and butterflies. Penstemons, all penstemons are great. We have a lot in New Mexico. The pine leaves penstemon will grow in just straight rock, gets covered with flowers. There's a red cultivar and an orange cultivar, and pollinators adore it. Penstemon strictus is its cousin and is super showy, purple. Another pollinator magnet, has these bluish purple flowers June to August, loves sun, doesn't need much water. All of these, just ask for the slideshow and you can go back over these. Monarda bee balm, this will grow in partial shade. It's butterflies, bees, hummingbirds, hummingbird moths love it. And we can also drink it as a tea. It's a wonderful plant. The spherulicas, these will grow right out of a sidewalk crack. They're the globe mallows, and they bloom May to October. They attract native bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. And the augustifolia, which is the taller, more individual stemmed one, is a larval plant for many butterflies and moths. Opuntias, I call these the pollinator party houses. These prickly pear cactus, I walked by this one day and it was just like Grand Central Station with bees and flies and everybody coming in. They are prickly, so put them somewhere out of the way. And quickly we'll go through some trees and shrubs. They're important for nesting sites and materials. They offer shelter and protection. Flowers, often fruit and seeds. There are evergreen varieties that offer year-round color and habitat. They create structure and layering to the garden and often shade. Amelanchier, serviceberry, it's called that because it gets these wonderful berries that the birds like and also we can eat. They have showy white blossoms April to June. They can get pretty large. They do best in partial shade, and they like deep watering through the summer, just maybe once a week. And they're a nectar plant for insects and browse and fruit for birds, and they're great for habitat and nesting. Cercocarpus is the little leaf mountain mahogany, and it's an evergreen. I've wanted to include an evergreen, and then it gets flowers in the early spring that the bees love. It's a slow grower, so get it in a big pot. Plants of the Southwest have a lot of these plants. The desert willow is just a showstopper, gorgeous, deciduous shrubby tree, and the hummingbirds, bumblebees, and other pollinators love it. Doesn't need much water and it grows in the full sun. My personal favorite, New Mexico olive. This just looks amazing most of the year. It gets yellow blooms in the early spring that are really important early nectar for bees, great fall color, and fruit in the fall for birds. And then little leaf mock orange, smells heavenly. It gets these showy white flowers late spring to early summer. It's deciduous, but when it's doing its thing, it's great. A great bee plant and bird habitat. They can nest safely in there. Whoops. And then I've included some ideas. Let me make sure that I got it. For getting kids involved, but I think I told you a lot of those during this, and we're running out of time, and I want to make sure you have time for questions. So please ask us for the PowerPoint and we'll be happy to send it to you. And these are some of the resources. There's an expanded list of resources. If you want to take a picture of this QR code or scan it with your camera. And I'm gonna keep this up here, but Kaitlin, can we open up questions now?
Yeah, definitely. And I can put the link that this QR code goes to in the chat too.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
So let me see if these are our email addresses, and we're happy. I know that was fast. I tried to tell you too much, but please feel free to write to any of us with any questions. So in the chat,
I haven't gotten too many questions in the chat so far. Katrine was asking about some New Mexico legislation that Mimi Stewart introduced last year, and if Xerces would help try to pass that again. I was not directly involved with that. Our pesticide program lead, May Code, she was helping try to pass that, giving recommendations on the bill to make it more likely to pass in the agricultural committee, but it was killed in the Senate. So unfortunately, that bill to ban neonicotinoids, sorry, that's what the bill was about. I think I glossed over that. There was a bill last year to ban neonicotinoid use in New Mexico. It did not make it, but I'm sure we are looking into supporting many other state bills or building policy support capacity at Xerces. So it's definitely in the works. And yeah, feel free to just like start jumping in and asking questions. I will mention there was one question about bees coming to hummingbird feeders. And if that's an issue, covering like all the openings on a hummingbird feeder, I would say, you know, they're using that, maybe they're thirsty if you want to try and put out just water with some rocks where bees can land. But the main thing about these kind of watering stations, nectar stations like this is that they can spread disease. So consider cleaning them frequently so that there's not disease harboring there. So, and yeah, let's see.
I see one, Ashlyn. We will post the recording to the same site where the QR code will take you, if that makes any sense, or you can email me or Kaitlin directly, and we'll send it to you. Is that right, Kaitlin?
Yeah. The recording, since we're still recording, it will take a while for it to be available on my computer, but once it's uploaded, we have all your emails and we'll share that.
Anyone else have questions or comments or experiences in your own gardens? Is everybody off mute? Kaitlin?
Yes.
Are folks unmuted?
So I don't think I can unmute everyone, but anyone can unmute themselves and ask questions. Feel free to just jump right in or type it in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Milkweed, Kaitlin, last year, Agua Fria Nursery had milkweed, and so did Plants of the Southwest. Kaitlin, is that in your habitat kit?
Yes, so the habitat kits have the low to medium water kit has showy milkweed, and the low water kit has the horsetail milkweed, that Asclepias subverticillata. So yes, I think I put the link to the Habitat Kit website in the chat earlier, but yeah, if you are interested in participating in our Habitat Kit program, the interest forms are available online now until the end of June, and the kits will be distributed in the last weekend of August. So if you are patient and willing to wait for those little 2-inch pots of milkweed, you can get them through that.
Yeah, I also found them through High Mountain Gardens, which is a mail order, but they started in Santa Fe. They're not in Santa Fe now, but they have Santa Fe specific plants. And mine came in really good shape, actually, for a mail order plant. I was surprised.
Yeah, I think you said High Mountain. I think it's High Country
Yes,
Garden. Yeah,
High Country Garden. Sorry. The link to that is also in the resources. And I can go back to those if anyone wants to.
So the man who owns the Waterwise Gardening in Santa Fe on Rufina Street, he is the person that started High Country Gardens and sold it 10 years ago. So, and they're having their annual or semi-annual or whatever it is. So the sale right now through Saturday, I think. And I was just there and bought a bunch of plants. So they have a lot of pollinator type things.
Oh, great. Thank you for that.
So I wanted to say, because I'm up in Los Alamos and we just had to, we were preparing in case we had to evacuate. And so everyone was cutting limbs of trees and pulling up things from the garden. So as far as keeping things on the ground, what can I say? There's some balance between, being fire safe and helping things. So can you address that maybe?
Yeah, and also Kaitlin can, but I'm mostly referring to just small things like leaves or stems of penstemons, that kind of stuff, much less so large like branches and flammables. And I think you have to balance those considerations with providing habitat. So even if you just made a pile of leaves in a corner of your garden, that would be a help. Like we can't sacrifice safety for it, but you can just leave a couple of penstemons that still have their stems and then a pile of leaves in a corner. But Kaitlin, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, just about that. You got to have defensible space around your home in New Mexico. So it's totally understandable to, disturb some pollinator habitat to, make sure you can provide pollinator habitat in the future. So yeah, it's definitely something that's, not a detriment to make your home more safe. But yes, if you can leave little bit and, position them so that they aren't, if they do happen to catch fire, they're not right next to a structure or some other flammable materials, so that if it does get any worse, we can at least have some space between where you are creating that habitat. And that also leads into the, perhaps there is some structure treatment of pesticides around your home or around any structure on your property, moving that pollinator habitat a little further away from your house just to help prevent pests, prevent any kind of flammable materials near the house is a good idea.
Yeah, and also there are lots of annuals that are great pollinator plants, and anything you do is going to be a plus. So even if you're just providing nectar and pollen for the season, that's already a benefit. What we offer is sort of the full service pollinator paradise, but whatever piece you can do helps. Even just not using pesticides is a big help, or yeah, whatever you can do is already a good start.
So I do have another question for one of you. So I'm not so familiar with which, with the names of plants when I go out into my garden and I see things that are popping up naturally. And because it's been so hard to grow things back in the garden, when I see something growing, when it's growing in a spot where I don't want it, I try to move it to another spot. But I actually don't know whether it's an invasive weed or, or invasive plant, or if it's something that the pollinators would like. And I don't know how to find out how to identify these things and see whether, is it good to move it, or do you have a sense? I feel like if it's growing, let it grow.
Yeah.
Well, so I transplant it to another spot.
Yeah, that's a great thing. And I meant to say something to that and felt like I was running out of time. I didn't want to cut people's questions off, but there's an app called iNaturalist, which is a really good app for like taking a picture of something that you don't know what it is. I did that with flowers that were in my yard, and I posted it. It'll give you some suggestions for what it probably is based on where you are when you take the picture. And then there are people who are also on iNaturalist who will correct it or give you the right name. That's one way. The other is that the North American Native Plant Society is all over the country. And we have a chapter in Santa Fe, and they're a great resource for native plant identification. The Master Gardeners are a great resource, and Xerces is a great resource. And in your resource list, we have links to the Xerces native plants of this area, and the Santa Fe Native Plant Society, and then invasive.org is a great one for weeds. And as Kaitlin just posted, the weed guide with Pajarito, I think, which is here out in Los Alamos. I'm in White Rock, so right nearby. Those are all great ways of identifying whether you have a nasty weed or a nice wildflower or native plant. Does that answer it?
Yes, thank you very much.
Great. We're at 7:32. I know people may need to go and have dinner or whatever. Are there any other questions or comments before we sign off? No. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. I hope that you walk away with even one thing that feels helpful or inspires you to plant something or to watch butterflies and bees in a different way. We really, really enjoyed doing this and sharing what we have a great passion for. And Beverly, yes, would you email me and I'll make sure to get that to you? Did you get my email?
I think I wrote down Caitlin's email. Yeah.
Yeah, if
you
you
have
go
it?
to that link of
great.
the
Okay.
resources,
Yeah,
the link to the slides is there too.
This
But
QR
we can
code.
email everyone too, just so you all have it in one email without having to go searching.
Okay.
Yeah, thank
Great.
you, Dana. Thank you, Emily Ruth. And thanks to everyone that came out tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye. Nice. Let me stop recording.